The next shock we're going to look at is a temporary supply shock. We look at the price of oil suddenly increasing. So a temporary increase in the price of oil, which will shift my short run aggregate supply curve up. Let's see what that does to our economy. So it shifts this aggregate supply curve up as we see here. So we'll call this aggregate supply sub B. And what we notice is we get the situation called stagflation, where we see a negative output gap, meaning we see output decreasing and unemployment increasing. And we see a positive inflation gap. So we're seeing inflation rising and unemployment rising because our output is declining. This would be point B. And let's see how this plays out elsewhere. This lower level of output is going to have a higher interest rate associated with it, which matches up. That as we see inflation go up, that Taylor principle says we should see that higher real interest rate being targeted by the Federal Reserve. So everything matches up. We see this higher inflation, we see higher real interest rates, and this is what we call a stagflationary period because of an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Just like we saw with our aggregate demand shocks, we're going to first look if we see no policy response. If we see no policy response, what's going to happen? Well, this is very similar to what we saw before. At point B, right, we know that output is less than potential GDP. So this is our negative output gap. And with our negative output gap, we know that we are going to see slack develop in the labor market. So we have slack in the labor market. And this slack in the labor market will end up with downward pressure on those wages. So we have downward pressure on wages, which will then lead to inflation expectations start to come down finally, although this could take some time because inflation has started to go up, and this will make that aggregate supply curve come back down. So this, coupled with hopefully this is a temporary shock, so the price of oil will start to come back down, we should see aggregate supply just correct itself. So what we would see here in this case is aggregate supply just come back down. So again, this is a pretty standard case. So aggregate supply part C. So A would be C. Nothing else changes. So we just go back to A equals to C, which means we just go back to A equals to C. Interest rates fall back down. Inflation falls back down. Output goes back up. And so we see the economy self-correcting. Now this looks great, but this could take a very long time, especially if prices are pretty sticky. And if we see this high level of inflation with a high level of unemployment, that's going to be really bad for the economy during that short run period when we're out of equilibrium. So perhaps we want to see some policy. What we're going to look at is only monetary policy in this case, because that's the interesting case. And we're going to see if they want to close the output gap or if they want to close the inflation gap, because we're going to have to make a choice. And that's going to depend on what type of policy you want to conduct. So that's the next thing we're going to do.